Victorian England, 1847. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones as Lady Diana Russell gazed out at the dreary London fog enveloping the city. Rain tapped against the windows, matching the nervous rhythm of her heart. Her gloved fingers twisted anxiously in her lap, creasing the expensive fabric of her travelling dress, a dress that had cost her father's last remaining guineas. "We are nearly there, my lady," her lady's maid Martha whispered, breaking the oppressive silence that had accompanied them since departing from Russell House that morning. Diana nodded, unable to find her voice. The knot in her stomach tightened as the carriage turned onto a grand avenue lined with stately townhouses. In less than an hour she would meet the man who was to become her husband, the Marquis of Blackwood, Lord George Churchill, a man she had never met, but whose reputation preceded him. Cold, calculating, powerful. The Russell estate was in ruins. Her father, the once respected Earl of Harlington, had gambled away their fortune before passing away in a riding accident 3 months prior, leaving Diana and her ailing mother with nothing but crushing debt and a crumbling manor. The marriage contract with the Marquis promised to save what remained of their family lands and provide for her mother's medical care. "Is it wrong to feel like a sacrificial lamb, Martha?" Diana asked quietly, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. Being sold to save what remains of the Russell name, Martha's weathered face softened with sympathy. She had been with Diana since childhood, and was the closest thing to family she had left, besides her bedridden mother. "It's an honourable thing you're doing, my lady. There's no shame in securing your family's future." "Honour?" Diana repeated with a hollow laugh. "How strange that my honour is measured by my willingness to marry a stranger." The carriage finally pulled through imposing iron gates and up a long winding drive. Blackwood Manor emerged from the mist, a massive stone structure with Gothic turrets and chimneys stretching toward the grey skies like grasping fingers. It was magnificent and terrifying all at once, its windows dark and unwelcoming despite the early afternoon hour. Diana's throat tightened. This formidable place would be her prison or her home, depending on the mercy of its master. "Remember your training, my lady," Martha said softly, reaching over to straighten Diana's bonnet. "Shoulders back, chin high." Diana squared her shoulders beneath her travelling cloak. "I am a Russell. I will not show fear." "That's the spirit," Martha nodded approvingly. "Your mother would be proud." The carriage lurched to a stop on the gravelled forecourt. A footman appeared, opening the door and extending an umbrella. Diana descended, her legs stiff from the long journey. The house loomed over her, even more imposing up close, its stone facade darkened by decades of London smoke and fog. A butler awaited at the entrance, his posture as rigid as the marble columns flanking the door. "Lady Diana Russell," he intoned with a formal bow. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. I am Harrison, the butler. If you would follow me, the Marquis awaits in his study." Diana was escorted through a labyrinth of hallways, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and priceless artifacts from across the empire, evidence of the Churchill family's extensive wealth and influence. The grandeur of the house made her family's once proud manor seem like a cottage in comparison. Every footstep echoed on the marble floors, announcing her presence in this domain where she was still a stranger. "Your maid will be shown to the servants' quarters," Harrison informed her as they approached a heavy oak door at the end of a long corridor. "The Marquis prefers to speak with you privately." Diana's stomach clenched, but she nodded. "Thank you, Harrison." "The Marquis will see you now, Lady Russell," the butler announced, opening the door with a practiced flourish. Taking a deep breath, Diana stepped into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The study was dominated by a massive mahogany desk, behind which stood a tall figure silhouetted against a rain-streaked window. He turned slowly at her entrance, and Diana caught her breath. Lord George Churchill was not what she had expected. Though his face was set in severe lines, he was undeniably handsome. Perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, his attire immaculate. There was a coldness to his bearing that made Diana shiver despite the fire burning in the grate. "Lady Diana Russell," he said, his voice deep and devoid of warmth. It was a statement, not a question. She curtsied gracefully as she had been taught. "My lord, I trust your journey was comfortable." He gestured to a chair positioned before his desk. "Please sit." Diana perched on the edge of the offered seat, her back straight as a board, hands folded demurely in her lap as she had been instructed since childhood. "Yes, thank you for arranging the carriage." The Marquis remained standing, studying her with clinical detachment, as though she were a horse at auction. His gaze travelled from her face to her modest travelling attire and back again, assessing her value. Diana fought the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. "I've reviewed the contract your solicitor sent," he finally said, moving to a side table where documents were neatly arranged. "Everything appears to be in order." He walked to a sideboard and poured himself a glass of amber liquid without offering her refreshment. "I assume you understand the terms of our arrangement." "I do," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Your financial support in exchange for the Russell name joining with the Churchills." "Precisely." He took a measured sip from his glass. "I require an heir, and society expects a man in my position to have a wife. Your bloodline is impeccable despite your father's indiscretions." Diana flinched at the reference to her father, but kept her composure. "And the Russell estate will be restored." "It will be managed properly," he corrected, his tone making it clear there was a significant difference. "Under my supervision. Your mother will be provided for, and your family name preserved." He set his glass down with a sharp click against the wooden surface. "But let us be perfectly clear about what this is, and what it is not." He approached her, his expression unreadable as he stood uncomfortably close. Diana could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something else she couldn't name. "I should make something clear before we proceed, Lady Diana. While this union will be legal in every sense, you should harbour no romantic illusions. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." Diana met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite her racing heart. "I understand perfectly, my lord." "Good." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Then I shall be plain. You will have your own apartments in the East Wing. You will fulfill your social obligations as the Marchioness of Blackwood. You will behave with propriety at all times. But make no mistake," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "you will never be my true wife." The words cut through her like ice, but Diana refused to show how deeply they wounded her pride. She had expected a loveless marriage, but the cold finality of his declaration still stung like a slap. "Is that understood?" he pressed, his blue eyes boring into hers. Something within Diana, the same stubborn pride that had sustained her through her father's disgrace and death, flared to life. She rose from her chair, squaring her shoulders to face him directly, though he still towered over her. "Perfectly, my lord. And I hope you understand that I am not entering this arrangement with any delusions of affection. I do this for my family, just as you do this for yours. I require no false sentiment, only the respect due to the future bearer of your name and the mother of your heirs." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her boldness, before his expression hardened once more. "The wedding will take place in 3 days' time. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, will show you to your rooms and acquaint you with the household schedule." He turned his back to her, a clear dismissal. "Good day, Lady Diana." As the door closed behind her, Diana fought to maintain her composure. A severe-looking woman awaited in the corridor, Mrs. Winters, presumably, who led her through another maze of corridors to the East Wing without a single word of welcome. The rooms assigned to her were spacious and luxuriously appointed, with silk damask wallpaper and heavy velvet draperies, yet they felt as cold and impersonal as her future husband. Nothing about them spoke of warmth or comfort, merely wealth displayed for its own sake. "Dinner is served at 7 precisely," Mrs. Winters informed her, her tone suggesting that tardiness would be an unforgivable sin. "The Marquis dines alone most evenings, but expects you to join him tonight. Your maid will be up shortly with your belongings." When the housekeeper had gone, Diana sank onto a brocade settee, finally allowing her shoulders to slump. She had known what she was sacrificing when she agreed to this arrangement, but the reality of her future, stretching before her like a vast, empty plain, was more daunting than she had imagined. Martha arrived soon after, fussing over Diana's appearance and unpacking her modest trousseau into the massive wardrobes. "The servants are all aflutter about you," she reported, as she brushed out Diana's travel-worn dress. "It seems the Marquis hasn't entertained a lady at Blackwood Manor since his father died 3 years ago." "I am hardly being entertained," Diana said wryly. "I am a business acquisition, nothing more." Martha clucked her tongue. Now, things may not be as bleak as they appear. The Marquis is young yet, and handsome enough. Perhaps in time— No, Martha, Diana interrupted gently. The Marquis has made his position quite clear. This marriage is a transaction, not a romance. She moved to the window, gazing out at the formal gardens below, now shrouded in mist. I would rather face the truth than nurture false hope. That evening, dinner was a silent affair, broken only by the clink of silver against fine china and the occasional murmured instruction to the footman. The Marquis spoke little, and Diana, exhausted from the journey and their earlier encounter, had no energy for meaningless pleasantries. When they parted in the grand hallway, he merely inclined his head. "Until tomorrow, Lady Diana." That night, alone in her new bedchamber with its elaborate furnishings and oppressive silence, Diana stood at the window, watching moonlight break through the clouds to illuminate the formal gardens below. "I may never be his true wife," she whispered to herself, "but I will not be broken by this place or by him. I am Diana Russell of Harlington, and I still have my pride." She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. "This may be a prison of circumstance, but I will find a way to make it bearable. I must." Little did she know that fate had other plans for the Marquis of Blackwood and his reluctant bride. 3 days later, Diana stood in St. George's Church in Hanover Square, wearing a wedding gown of ivory silk and Belgian lace, a gown chosen and paid for by her soon-to-be husband. Her mother was too ill to attend, but had sent a small pearl brooch, the last of her jewelry that hadn't been sold to pay creditors, which Diana wore pinned over her heart. The church was filled with London's elite, though Diana recognized few faces. They had come not out of affection for either bride or groom, but out of curiosity, eager to witness the union between the notorious Marquis and the daughter of the disgraced Earl. Diana stood perfectly still as the Archbishop performed the ceremony, her face a composed mask that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. The Marquis stood beside her, equally impassive, reciting his vows with the detached precision of a man conducting a routine business transaction. When he slid the gold band onto her finger, his touch was impersonal, his expression unchanged. He spoke his vows clearly and without hesitation, but there was no warmth in his words, no promise of devotion beyond what was written in their contract. As they rode back to Blackwood Manor in silence, now husband and wife, Diana caught the Marquis studying her reflection in the carriage window. "You played your part well," he said, the first words he'd spoken to her directly since the ceremony. "The Ton will have nothing to gossip about regarding the ceremony. I am gratified to have met with your approval, my lord," she replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but perhaps the closest thing to it she had seen. "You have spirit, Lady Diana. That may serve you well in society so long as it is properly contained." The wedding breakfast was an elaborate affair, with countless dishes and fine wines, yet Diana could barely eat, her stomach knotted with tension. She performed her duties as the new Marchioness, smiling at the right moments, conversing pleasantly with guests who had come more out of curiosity than genuine goodwill. As she circulated among the crowd, she caught fragments of whispered conversations. Poor girl. Cold as ice, that one. Married for the money, no doubt. Each barbed comment strengthened her resolve to maintain her dignity. She would not give these vultures the satisfaction of seeing her distress. By evening, when the last guests had departed, Diana was exhausted, her face aching from the effort of maintaining her pleasant expression. She retreated to her chambers as instructed, relieved when there was no summons from her husband. Their arrangement, it seemed, extended to all aspects of marriage. As Martha helped her out of the elaborate wedding gown, Diana caught sight of herself in the mirror, the Marchioness of Blackwood, a title without substance, a wife in name only. "Perhaps it is better this way," she said quietly, as Martha unpinned her hair. "At least I know precisely where I stand." "It's early days yet, my lady," Martha said, arranging Diana's hair in a simple braid for the night. "Who knows what time may bring?" But as she lay awake in her bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of Blackwood Manor, Diana couldn't help but wonder about the man sleeping in another wing of the house. What had made him so cold? Why did he need this marriage if he wanted no true wife? The Marquis's words echoed in her mind. "You will never be my true wife." Diana pulled the covers tighter around herself as a chill wind rattled the windows. "We shall see, my lord," she whispered into the darkness. "We shall see." The weeks following the wedding unfolded in a pattern of careful routine at Blackwood Manor. Diana rose each morning to breakfast alone in her sitting room, spent her days familiarizing herself with the massive estate, and dined with her husband only when social obligations demanded it. The Marquis remained as distant as the moon, disappearing to London on business for days at a time without explanation, and secluding himself in his study when present. Diana's life as Marchioness of Blackwood bore little resemblance to the marriage she had once imagined for herself. There were no shared confidences, no gentle touches, no companionship. Instead, she found herself mistress of a grand house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, populated by servants who watched her with curious, sometimes pitying eyes. Yet Diana refused to surrender to self-pity. If she could not have a true marriage, she would at least make herself useful. She began by learning the names of every servant, from the highest-ranking butler to the lowest scullery maid. She studied the household accounts, memorized the family histories of the tenant farmers, and explored every corner of the sprawling estate. Knowledge, she decided, was her best defense against feeling like an interloper. "My lady," Mrs. Winters approached her one morning in the conservatory, where Diana had been arranging flowers, "these tasks are hardly befitting your station. We have gardeners for cutting flowers." Diana continued her work, selecting a pale pink rose to complement the arrangement. "I find it soothing, Mrs. Winters. Besides, I have always believed that idleness breeds discontent." The housekeeper's lips thinned with disapproval. The previous Marchioness never concerned herself with such matters. The previous Marchioness? Diana paused, scissors in hand. "You mean the Marquis's mother?" "Indeed, Lady Eleanor Churchill," Mrs. Winters replied, her tone softening slightly. "A most refined lady. She understood the proper distance between the family and the staff." Diana set down her scissors, suddenly curious. In all the weeks she had been at Blackwood Manor, her husband had never once mentioned his mother. "Tell me about her, Mrs. Winters. What was she like?" The housekeeper hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "She was gentle, kind even, perhaps too kind for her own good." Something flickered across her face, an old grief, quickly masked. "But it is not my place to speak of family matters, my lady." Before Diana could press further, a footman appeared at the conservatory entrance. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but the Marquis has returned from London and requests your presence in the drawing-room." Surprised by the unusual summons, Diana hastily removed her gardening apron and smoothed her hair. "Thank you, James. Please tell his lordship I shall be there directly." She found the Marquis standing by the window, still wearing his travelling clothes. He turned at her entrance, and Diana was struck by how weary he appeared. Dark shadows underscored his eyes, and there was a tightness to his mouth she had not seen before. "You wish to see me, my lord," she said, curtsying slightly. "Yes." He gestured to a small rosewood table where a tea service had been laid. "Please sit. I have some matters to discuss." Diana obeyed, her curiosity piqued by this unprecedented invitation. In the 6 weeks of their marriage, they had never taken tea together, let alone engaged in private conversation beyond the most perfunctory exchanges. The Marquis remained standing, his posture rigid. "I have been informed that my cousin Lady Caroline Blackwell and her daughter intend to visit next week. They will stay for a fortnight." Diana nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite her surprise. "I shall ensure the guest rooms are prepared appropriately. There is more." He paced before the fireplace, his movements restless. "Lady Caroline was close to my father. After my mother's death, she frequently acted as his hostess for social gatherings." Something in his tone caught Diana's attention, a barely perceptible edge that suggested deep dislike. "I understand," she said carefully. "Would you prefer that I defer to her regarding household matters during her stay?" "No." His response was swift and emphatic. "You are the Marchioness of Blackwood now. This is your household to manage as you see fit." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Lady Caroline may attempt to assert her influence. She is accustomed to having her way at Blackwood Manor." Diana studied her husband's face, sensing there was much he was not saying. "And how would you prefer I handle such attempts?" For the first time, a flicker of something almost like approval crossed his features. "With the same spirit you have shown thus far, Lady Diana. My cousin respects strength, if little else." The conversation was interrupted by Harrison announcing that the Marquis's bath had been prepared. As her husband moved to leave, Diana found herself speaking without forethought. "My lord, I know very little of your family," she said. "If I am to navigate this visit successfully, perhaps you might enlighten me further." The Marquis paused at the door, his back to her. For a moment, Diana thought he would ignore her request. Then, without turning, he said, "My mother died when I was 12. A fever. Lady Caroline arrived before the funeral and has been inserting herself into Churchill affairs ever since." His voice hardened. "She has a daughter, Miss Adelaide, who is near your age. They are our closest living relatives, but do not mistake that for affection." With those cryptic words he departed, leaving Diana with more questions than answers. That evening at dinner, another rare occasion when they dined together, Diana ventured to probe further. "Tell me about your mother, my lord. Mrs. Winters mentioned she was much beloved by the staff." The Marquis's knife stilled against his plate. "Did she?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "She seemed reluctant to elaborate," Diana admitted, "but I should like to know more about the lady whose place I now occupy." Her husband resumed cutting his meat with precise movements. "My mother was unlike anyone else in our circle," he finally said. "She came from a respectable family, but not one of great wealth or title. My father married her despite considerable opposition from his family." "For love?" Diana asked, unable to imagine the cold Marquis being the product of a love match. A shadow crossed his face. "So I was led to believe. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her spirit that captivated everyone who knew her. She treated servants with the same courtesy she showed to dukes. She insisted on personally supervising my education, rather than sending me away to school." His voice softened imperceptibly. "The gardens were her particular passion. The rose garden beyond the East Terrace was her creation." Diana recalled the neglected garden she had discovered during her explorations, once magnificent, but now overgrown and wild. "The one with the marble fountain." He nodded, something distant in his eyes. "She spent hours there, especially in summer." "Why has it been allowed to fall into disrepair?" Diana asked gently. The Marquis's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "After her death, my father ordered it abandoned. He had the gardeners focus their efforts elsewhere." His tone made it clear that the subject was closed. They finished the meal in silence, but as they rose from the table, the Marquis surprised her once more. "If you wished to restore the garden," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I would have no objection." Before Diana could respond, he bowed stiffly and left the room. The next morning, Diana sought out the head gardener, Mr. Hobbs, a weathered man with soil-ingrained hands and kind eyes. When she inquired about Lady Eleanor's rose garden, his face lit up with unexpected enthusiasm. "Oh, my lady, it was the jewel of Blackwood," he said, removing his cap. "Such roses you've never seen, varieties from all over the world. The old Marquis had them imported specially for her ladyship." "Why was it abandoned?" Diana asked, walking beside him toward the neglected garden. Hobbs's expression clouded. "Not my place to say, my lady, but it broke my heart to watch it go to ruin. The young master, the Marquis, that is, he used to help his mother tend the roses when he was a lad. Had a knack for it, he did." Diana tried to imagine her stern, reserved husband as a boy, helping his mother among the roses. The image seemed impossibly at odds with the man she knew. "Could it be restored, do you think?" she asked as they reached the garden's wrought-iron gate. "Aye, with time and care." Hobbs ran a loving hand over the rusted gate. "The bones are still good. Roses are hardy things. They survive more than you'd expect." "Then let us begin," Diana decided. "I want detailed plans by the end of the week, Mr. Hobbs. We'll start with clearing the overgrowth and assessing which plants can be saved." The old gardener's face broke into a broad smile. "It would be my greatest pleasure, my lady." Over the next several days, Diana threw herself into the garden restoration project. She consulted the estate's old planting records, studied books on horticulture from the library, and spent hours working alongside the gardeners, heedless of the dirt that stained her gowns or the sun that flushed her cheeks. The Marquis made no comment on her activities, though Diana occasionally glimpsed him watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. Whether he approved or disapproved remained a mystery, but she continued nonetheless, finding unexpected satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos of tangled vines and neglected beds. It was during her third day of garden work that Diana discovered the small stone bench hidden beneath an overgrown arbor. As the gardeners cleared away the strangling vines, a name was revealed, carved into the seat. Eleanor. The Marquis had it made for her 15th birthday, a voice said behind her. Diana turned to find Mrs. Winters standing at the garden's edge, her usual stern expression softened by memory. They were very close then, Diana asked. The housekeeper nodded. As close as mother and son could be. She was his shield against... She stopped abruptly, seeming to remember herself. Against the usual hardships of childhood, my lady. Diana sensed there was more to the story, much more. But she had learned that direct questions rarely yielded answers in this house of secrets. Instead, she brushed her soil-covered hands on her apron and said casually, I should like to make this bench the centerpiece of the restored garden, Mrs. Winters. Perhaps surrounded by white roses? They symbolize remembrance, I believe. Something like approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. Her ladyship was partial to white roses, as it happens. She called them her moonlight blossoms. For the first time since Diana's arrival, Mrs. Winters offered what might almost be called a smile. The master was born on a full moon night, she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Lady Eleanor always said it was why he was so stubborn. Touched by moon magic, she called it. The confidence, small as it was, felt like a victory. Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Winters. I shall keep that in mind as we plan the garden's restoration. That evening, unable to sleep, Diana ventured to the library in search of a book. The vast room, lined with thousands of volumes collected over generations, was usually deserted at this hour. But as she pushed open the heavy door, she was startled to find her husband already there. The Marquis stood by a window, a small object cradled in his hands, his face illuminated only by moonlight. He had not heard her enter, and for a moment Diana observed him unguarded. Gone was the cold, impassive mask he wore like armor. In its place was an expression of such raw grief that Diana nearly gasped aloud. He was staring down at what appeared to be a miniature portrait, his fingers tracing its edges with a tenderness she had never witnessed from him. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot and the Marquis's head snapped up. His eyes widened at the sight of her, and he hastily slipped the portrait into his waistcoat pocket. Forgive me, Diana said quickly. I did not mean to intrude. It is of no consequence. His voice had resumed its usual detached tone, though Diana noticed his hands were not entirely steady. You could not have known I would be here. An awkward silence stretched between them. Diana was acutely aware of her informal appearance, hair loosely braided for sleep, dressed only in her nightgown and dressing robe. The Marquis, by contrast, remained fully clothed, as though he had not yet retired, despite the late hour. I came in search of a book, she explained, gesturing vaguely toward the shelves. Something to help me sleep. Try the east wall, he suggested, his composure fully restored. Third shelf from the top. Tennyson's poems often induce slumber in even the most restless minds. The attempt at humor, however slight, surprised her. You speak from experience, my lord. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Perhaps. Diana moved toward the indicated shelf, feeling his eyes follow her. As she reached for the volume, her dressing gown slipped slightly, revealing a fading bruise on her forearm, a souvenir from her enthusiastic gardening efforts. You're injured, the Marquis said sharply. Diana quickly adjusted her sleeve. It's nothing. Merely an encounter with a particularly stubborn rosebush. He crossed to her side with unexpected swiftness, taking her arm with gentle fingers and pushing back the sleeve to examine the bruise. His touch, the first voluntary contact between them since their wedding day, sent an inexplicable warmth through her. Roses have thorns for a reason, he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. They are not meant to be tamed easily. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that had nothing to do with the minor injury, that made Diana's breath catch. The most beautiful things often require the most care, she replied, her voice hardly above a whisper. For a moment, they stood frozen in that tableau, his fingers on her skin, their faces close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. Then, as if suddenly remembering himself, the Marquis released her arm and stepped back. "Good night, Lady Diana," he said, his voice once again formal. "I trust you will find Tennyson adequate company." He strode from the room without a backward glance, leaving Diana to wonder at the brief connection that had flared between them like a match struck in darkness. The next morning, Diana found a small package outside her door, a jar of salve wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no note, but the gesture spoke volumes coming from a man who had declared she would never be his true wife. That same afternoon, as Diana supervised the clearing of a choked pathway in the rose garden, a familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "So, this is where you've been hiding yourself," the Marquis said, surveying the transformation taking place. Where once had been wilderness, neat piles of cleared debris now stood alongside freshly turned earth and salvaged plants. Diana straightened, pushing a stray lock of hair from her perspiring forehead. "Hardly hiding, my lord. We've been making quite a racket, I'm afraid." "Indeed." His eyes moved over the garden, taking in the progress. "Mr. Hobbs informs me you've been working alongside the gardeners. Is that wise?" "Wiser than wasting my days on idle gossip and needlepoint, I should think," Diana replied with more spirit than she had intended. Then, softening her tone, she added, "Besides, I find the work satisfying. To see order emerging from chaos. There is a certain pleasure in that." The Marquis studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You continue to surprise me, Lady Diana. Is that good or ill, my lord? I have yet to decide." He glanced toward the stone bench, now freed from its prison of vines and partially cleaned. "You found my mother's seat?" Diana nodded. "Mrs. Winters told me you had it made for her. For her 35th birthday," he corrected. "Not her 15th, as I suspect Mrs. Winters said. Our housekeeper's memory sometimes plays tricks on her these days." "It's a beautiful piece," Diana said. "I thought to make it the centerpiece of the garden, surrounded by white roses. Mrs. Winters mentioned they were your mother's favorite." The Marquis was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the carved name. "White roses were indeed her favorite," he finally said, "but she preferred them mingled with red ones. She said it made the white seem purer by contrast. This personal recollection freely offered felt like a gift." "Then we shall plant them as she preferred," Diana said softly. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, his gaze sharp upon her face. Diana considered her answer carefully. "Because something beautiful should not be left to ruin," she said at last. "Because your mother created this place with love, and such things deserve to be honored." She paused, then added quietly, "And because I have little else to occupy my days in a house where I am more ornament than wife." The last words slipped out unbidden, and Diana immediately regretted them. But instead of the cold rebuke she expected, the Marquis merely looked thoughtful. "My mother would have liked you, I think," he said, the words seeming to surprise even himself. Before Diana could respond, he turned and walked away, his tall figure soon disappearing around the hedge. But the brief exchange had left her with a curious sense of hope, as if perhaps the first tiny crack had appeared in the wall between them. That evening, Diana retired early, exhausted from her day's exertions in the garden. As she sat before her dressing table, Martha brushing out her hair for the night, a knock sounded at the door to her sitting room. Martha went to answer it, returning moments later with a peculiar expression. "It's the Marquis, my lady," she whispered, eyes wide with surprise. "He asks if you would join him in the library when convenient." Diana's heart quickened. "Did he say why?" "No, my lady. Only that he has something to show you." Hastily donning a suitable evening dress, a simple blue silk that could be fastened without assistance, Diana made her way to the library, curious and slightly apprehensive. She found the Marquis standing before the fireplace, a leather-bound book in his hands. "Thank you for coming," he said, his usual formality softened by something that might almost be nervousness. "I thought you might find this of interest for your garden restoration project." He extended the book toward her. Diana took it carefully, opening the cover to reveal pages of delicate botanical illustrations, roses of every variety, painted in exquisite detail, with notes in a flowing feminine hand. "My mother's garden journal," the Marquis explained. "She documented every plant, its placement and care instructions. I thought it might be useful." Diana looked up from the precious volume, deeply moved by the gesture. "This is extraordinarily helpful, my lord. But are you certain you wish to entrust it to me? It must be very dear to you." "It is," he acknowledged, "but it was meant for a gardener's hands, not to gather dust in a drawer. My mother would have wanted it used." Diana ran her fingers gently over a particularly beautiful illustration of a climbing white rose. "She was talented." "She was," the Marquis agreed, and for the first time, Diana heard genuine warmth in his voice. "She taught herself botanical illustration. My father thought it a frivolous pursuit, but she persisted." Diana looked up sharply. "Your father disapproved of her interests?" Something dark flickered in the Marquis's eyes. "My father disapproved of many things that brought others joy." He turned away slightly, adding in a lower voice, "particularly things that brought her joy." The bitterness in his tone revealed volumes about the previous Marquis, and Diana began to understand something of the shadows that haunted her husband. Sensing that she had stumbled upon tender ground, she changed the subject. "Will you tell me about some of these varieties?" she asked, gesturing to the journal. "I confess I know little of roses beyond their beauty." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. To her surprise, the Marquis settled into a chair beside hers and began turning pages, pointing out particular specimens and recounting their origins. For over an hour they sat thus, heads bent together over the journal, their conversation flowing more naturally than ever before. It was only when the clock chimed 11 that the Marquis seemed to remember himself. "I've kept you too long," he said, rising abruptly. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive," Diana assured him, reluctant to break the spell of companionship that had briefly existed between them. "I have enjoyed our conversation immensely." He regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "As have I," he admitted, as if the realization surprised him. Perhaps we might continue it another evening." "I would like that very much," Diana said softly. For a moment longer, he stood looking at her, something unspoken in his gaze. Then he bowed formally and bid her good night. As Diana returned to her chambers, the precious garden journal clutched to her chest, she felt a cautious optimism stirring within her. The wall between them had not fallen, but tonight had revealed that it might not be as impenetrable as she had feared. 3 days later, however, any progress made was threatened by the arrival of Lady Caroline Blackwell and her daughter, Adelaide. From the moment they swept into Blackwood Manor in a flurry of silk and demands, Diana understood her husband's warning. Lady Caroline, a striking woman in her 40s with shrewd eyes and a practiced smile, immediately began inspecting the house with the air of one checking that her possessions had been properly maintained in her absence. "The drawing-room draperies are showing wear, George," she announced at dinner their first evening. "You really must have new ones commissioned. I saw the most divine fabric at Whitley's in London. I'd be happy to order it for you." The Marquis's expression remained neutral. "I believe such matters now fall under my wife's purview, Caroline." Lady Caroline's gaze swung to Diana, assessing her with barely concealed disdain. "Of course. How forgetful of me." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though perhaps Diana would appreciate my guidance being so new to her role. It can be quite overwhelming to manage a house of this stature, especially for someone not raised in our circles." The barb was thinly veiled, and Diana felt her cheeks warm. But before she could respond, the Marquis spoke. "My wife has been managing admirably," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Blackwood has never been in better hands." The unexpected defense left Diana momentarily speechless. Lady Caroline's smile tightened, but she merely inclined her head in acknowledgement before turning her attention to her daughter. Adelaide Blackwell was a pretty young woman of perhaps 20, with her mother's dark colouring but none of her sharp edges. Throughout dinner she sat silently, occasionally casting nervous glances at the Marquis when she thought no one was looking. After the meal, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Lady Caroline wasted no time in establishing her dominance. "You must find Blackwood quite provincial after London," she remarked, settling onto a sofa as though it were a throne. "Of course, you haven't been presented at court yet, have you? Such a pity your marriage was so hastily arranged." "I find Blackwood fascinating," Diana replied evenly, "and I've never been particularly drawn to London society." Lady Caroline laughed, a brittle sound. "How charmingly rustic. But surely you must feel the isolation. George is hardly known for his sociability. Adelaide and I used to despair of drawing him out even when he was a boy. So serious, always with his nose in a book or trailing after his mother in that garden of hers." She sighed dramatically. "Poor Eleanor. She never quite fit in, you know." From what I've heard, she was much beloved, Diana said carefully, noting how Adelaide tensed at the mention of the former Marchioness. Oh, by the servants, certainly, Lady Caroline conceded with a dismissive wave. She had a way with them. But in society, I'm afraid she was rather out of her depth. My cousin, the late Marquis, made a terrible mistake in marrying so far beneath him. Her eyes glittered as she examined Diana. A mistake George seems determined to repeat. The insult hung in the air between them. Diana felt her pulse quicken with anger, but years of training in proper behavior kept her expression composed. How fortunate, then, that the choice was his to make, she replied, with deceptive mildness. Just as the management of this household is now mine. She rose, smoothing her skirts. Speaking of which, I must speak with Mrs. Winters about tomorrow's menus. If you'll excuse me. She departed before Lady Caroline could respond, her heart pounding. Only when she was safely in the corridor did Diana allow herself a small, grim smile. The battle lines had been drawn. Later that night, as Martha prepared her for bed, Diana's thoughts remained troubled. She despised his mother, she mused aloud. I wonder why. Martha, ever discreet, hesitated before responding. There are whispers below stairs, my lady. The servants who have been here longest say that Lady Caroline had hoped to marry the old Marquis herself, before he chose Lady Eleanor instead. Diana's eyebrows rose. And she's harbored that resentment all these years. Some wounds fester rather than heal, Martha said wisely, especially those to pride. Diana thought of the garden journal, of the woman who had lovingly documented each rose. What had it been like for gentle Eleanor Churchill to live under the same roof as a woman who resented her very existence? There's more, Martha added, her voice dropping to a whisper. They say that after Lady Eleanor died, Lady Caroline was quick to console the old Marquis, very quick indeed. Within months she was acting as mistress of Blackwood, in all but name. Diana recalled her husband's cold voice. Lady Caroline arrived before the funeral and has been inserting herself into Churchill affairs ever since. The pieces were beginning to fit together, painting a picture of a household divided by grief, resentment, and perhaps something darker. And the Marquis, my husband, what was his relationship with Lady Caroline? Martha's expression grew troubled. I cannot say for certain, my lady. But the older servants hint that the young master suffered greatly after his mother's death, and not just from grief. A chill ran through Diana as she considered the implications. What kind of childhood had her husband endured in this grand cold house? What secrets lay buried beneath the polished floors of Blackwood Manor? As she lay awake that night, Diana's thoughts turned to the man sleeping in another wing of the house, a man who had declared she would never be his true wife, yet who had defended her against Lady Caroline's barbs, who had shared his mother's precious garden journal, who had perhaps begun to see her as something more than a convenient solution to a dynastic problem. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would continue her work in the garden, not just for the sake of honouring Eleanor Churchill's memory, but because somehow she sensed that in restoring what had been broken, she might find a way to reach the man whose heart had been similarly neglected. The fortnight of Lady Caroline's visit stretched Diana's patience to its limits, but she emerged victorious in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new attempts by the older woman to undermine Diana's authority in the household, yet with each challenge, the Marquis sided firmly with his wife. By the time the visitors departed, something had shifted in the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor, a subtle rebalancing of power that left Diana feeling more secure in her position than ever before. More importantly, the shared adversary had forged an unexpected alliance between Diana and her husband. The Marquis began joining her for breakfast, a meal they had never before shared. Their conversations, once stilted and formal, now flowed more easily, particularly when discussing the garden restoration, which had become Diana's passion. As summer faded into autumn, bringing cooler winds and shorter days, the garden began to take shape. The wild tangle had been cleared away, revealing the original pathways and beds. Many of the roses had proved remarkably resilient, sending up new shoots once freed from the choking weeds. With the guidance of Lady Eleanor's journal, Diana and Mr. Hobbs had created a planting scheme that honoured the original design while adding complementary new varieties. The Marquis took to walking the grounds each evening, his path invariably leading him to the rose garden where Diana often worked until dusk. He would observe her progress, sometimes offering memories of how the garden had looked in his mother's time. Occasionally, he would even roll up his sleeves and assist with a particularly stubborn root or help position a new trellis. During these shared moments, Diana caught glimpses of the man beneath the formal exterior, a man with unexpected gentleness in his hands and memories of happiness not entirely extinguished by grief. She began to understand that the cold, distant Marquis, who had declared she would never be his true wife, was a fortress built around a heart that had known too much pain. On a crisp October evening, as the last rays of sunlight gilded the turning leaves, Diana was supervising the installation of a small fountain near her mother-in-law's bench when the Marquis appeared at the garden entrance. His face was unusually grave, and he carried a letter in his hand. "My lord," Diana greeted him, setting down her gardening gloves. "Is something amiss?" "I've had word from London," he said, his voice tight. "There has been an outbreak of influenza in the city. Several prominent families have been affected." Diana's heart sank. Influenza was a dreaded visitor, capable of sweeping through entire households with devastating consequences. "Should we be concerned here at Blackwood?" "Perhaps." He folded the letter carefully. "I must travel to London tomorrow. My solicitor has fallen ill, and there are urgent matters that cannot wait." "Surely they can wait until the outbreak subsides," Diana protested. "It's not worth risking your health." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her concern. "The affairs of an estate this size do not pause for illness, Lady Diana. I will take precautions." Diana wanted to argue further, but knew it would be futile. Instead, she nodded, trying to mask her worry. "How long will you be gone?" "No more than 3 days," he assured her. "I shall return before the week's end." That night, as Diana prepared for bed, she found herself unusually restless. The thought of the Marquis exposing himself to the dangers of an influenza outbreak troubled her more deeply than she cared to admit. When had her feelings toward him shifted from wary curiosity to genuine concern? She could not pinpoint the moment, but she knew with certainty that the prospect of harm coming to him now caused her genuine distress. "You're fond of him," Martha observed quietly as she brushed Diana's hair. Diana met her maid's eyes in the mirror. "Is that so surprising?" "Not to me, my lady," Martha said with a small smile. "He's changed these past months. Anyone with eyes can see it." "Has he?" Diana murmured, more to herself than to Martha. "Or have I simply learned to see him more clearly?" "Perhaps both," Martha suggested wisely. The Marquis departed early the next morning, before Diana had risen. She found a brief note on her breakfast tray, written in his precise hand. "Lady Diana, I shall return by Friday. The garden journal remains in your capable hands. G." Those 3 days stretched longer than any Diana had experienced at Blackwood. She filled them with activity, supervising the garden work, reviewing household accounts, and writing long overdue letters to old friends. Yet her thoughts continually drifted to London and the man who had gone there despite the danger. On Friday morning, Diana woke with a sense of anticipation. She took extra care with her appearance, selecting a deep blue dress that Martha had once mentioned brought out the color in her eyes. When the Marquis had not arrived by dinner time, she told herself there had likely been delays on the road. Nothing to worry about. It was nearly midnight when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, the clatter of carriage wheels, the hurried footsteps of servants, and Harrison's voice raised in alarm. Diana threw a shawl over her nightgown and hurried downstairs, propriety forgotten in her concern. She found chaos in the main hall. The Marquis had indeed returned, but he was being supported between 2 footmen, his face alarmingly flushed, his normally immaculate appearance dishevelled. "My lord!" Diana rushed forward as the men helped him to a chair. The Marquis looked up at her through fever-glazed eyes. "Diana," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Forgive me. Did not wish to disturb you." Diana pressed her palm to his forehead and gasped at the heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning with fever. Harrison, send for Dr. Thompson immediately, and have a fire lit in the Marquis's chamber." "Already seen to, my lady," Harrison assured her, his usual stoic demeanor betraying concern. "James has gone for the doctor." "Help me get him upstairs," Diana instructed, her fear giving way to decisive action. "He needs to be in bed at once." Between the footman and Diana's support, they managed to get the Marquis to his bedchamber. His valet Stevens was already turning down the bed and stoking the fire. With efficient movements born of long service, he began removing the Marquis's travel-soiled clothing. "I shall wait outside," Diana said, moving toward the door to give her husband privacy. "No." The Marquis's fevered gaze found hers, unexpectedly lucid for a moment. "Stay, please." She nodded, turning her back while Stevens completed his task and helped the Marquis into a nightshirt. When he was settled in bed, Diana approached again, taking the chair that Stevens placed beside it. "What happened?" she asked gently, taking his hand. It was hot and dry in hers, the skin papery with fever. The Marquis closed his eyes briefly. Solicitor's household, all ill. Should have been more careful. A violent shiver racked his frame. Cold. So cold. Diana pulled the coverlet higher around his shoulders. "The doctor will be here soon," she assured him, though her heart raced with fear. She had seen influenza claim lives before, healthy young lives snuffed out in days. Dr. Thompson arrived within the hour, his lined face grave as he examined the Marquis. Diana waited anxiously in the adjoining sitting room, pacing before the fire until the doctor emerged. "Influenza, as I suspect you already guessed," he confirmed, closing his medical bag. "A severe case, I'm afraid. The next 48 hours will be critical." "What can be done?" Diana asked, her voice steady despite the fear clutching at her heart. "Keep him cool to combat the fever. Ensure he drinks water, broth if he can manage it. I've left laudanum for the pain and to help him sleep." The elderly physician hesitated, his kind eyes troubled. "My lady, I must warn you, the servants may be reluctant to attend him closely. There is always fear when sickness of this nature strikes a household." "I understand, Doctor," Diana said, squaring her shoulders. "Thank you for your candor." After Dr. Thompson departed, Diana called Mrs. Winters and Harrison to the drawing room. "The Marquis is gravely ill," she informed them, her voice calm despite her inner turmoil. "I will need a rotation of staff to assist in his care." Mrs. Winters and Harrison exchanged uncomfortable glances. "My lady," the housekeeper began, her normally austere face betraying unease, "the staff is concerned about contagion. The last time influenza swept through the house during the old Marquis's time, 3 servants died." Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "I see." She considered for a moment, then made her decision. "Then I shall tend to him myself." "My lady," Mrs. Winters gasped, scandalized. "That is hardly appropriate. Perhaps we could send for a nurse from the village." "There is no time," Diana said firmly. "And I will not have it said that the Marchioness of Blackwood abandoned her husband in his hour of need." She looked from one stunned face to the other. "I will require fresh water, clean linens, and broth to be brought at regular intervals. Beyond that, I will manage." "Yes, my lady," Harrison said, a new respect evident in his voice. As night fell, Diana took her place at the Marquis's bedside. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, his powerful frame now racked with fever and chills. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't understand. Diana dipped a cloth in cool water and gently bathed his face and neck. His skin burned beneath her fingers, his breathing labored. She had discarded her shawl hours ago, her hair falling loose down her back as she worked tirelessly to bring his temperature down. "You must fight this, George," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "You are too stubborn to let a mere fever defeat you." Throughout the long night, she tended him without rest, changing the cool compresses, coaxing sips of water between his parched lips, administering the laudanum when pain twisted his features. When his nightshirt became soaked with sweat, she changed it herself, her hands steady despite the intimacy of the task. It was near dawn during the darkest hour of the night when the Marquis's fever reached its peak. He thrashed against the bedclothes, calling out in distress. "Eleanor," he moaned. "Mother, don't leave me." Diana's heart clenched at the raw anguish in his voice. She took his hand between both of hers. "Shh, you're not alone," she soothed, stroking his brow. "I'm here with you, George. I'm here." His eyes opened, glazed with fever, not truly seeing her. "She's gone," he whispered brokenly. "He said it was my fault. My fault she died." "No," Diana said firmly, though she knew he was lost in delirium. "It was never your fault, George. Never." He gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Catherine," he murmured, a name Diana didn't recognize. "I'm sorry, couldn't save you." Diana continued to hold his hand as his words dissolved into restless sleep once more. Who was Catherine? Another piece of the puzzle that was her husband, a name connected to pain and regret. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, the Marquis's fever finally broke. Diana, exhausted beyond measure, laid her head on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand, and fell into an uneasy sleep. She woke to the sensation of fingers gently stroking her hair. Opening her eyes, she found the Marquis awake, his gaze clear for the first time in hours fixed upon her face. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse from the long night's ordeal. Diana sat up, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. Her hair loose, her dress wrinkled, dark shadows under her eyes. "Of course I stayed. The servants wouldn't come near," he said. It wasn't a question. They were afraid. "But you weren't." His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I was," she admitted quietly. "Not of the fever, but of losing you." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something shifting in his expression, a softening, a recognition. "You changed my nightshirt," he said after a moment, a hint of his old reserve returning. Diana felt heat rise to her cheeks. It needed to be done. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You continue to surprise me, Diana Russell." "Churchill," she corrected softly. "Diana Churchill." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something new and unnamed passing between them. Then, "Yes," he said quietly, "my wife." It wasn't a declaration of love, not even close. But in those two simple words, "my wife," spoken without the usual distance, Diana heard the first chime of a bell that had been silent for too long. As she rose to fetch fresh water, his hand caught hers once more. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. Diana nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Something had changed during that long night of vigil, something fundamental and irrevocable. In his moment of greatest vulnerability, the Marquis of Blackwood had revealed more of himself than in all the months of their marriage. And Diana, witnessing his pain and fear, had found something in her heart she hadn't expected. Not just duty or obligation, but a genuine desire to ease his suffering. As she slipped from the room to order fresh broth and linens, Diana realized with a start that she no longer viewed her marriage solely as an arrangement of convenience. Somewhere in the quiet hours of tending to a man lost in fever dreams, she had begun to care for her husband, perhaps even to love him. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The Marquis's recovery was slow but steady. For a week, he remained confined to his bed, his usually formidable strength sapped by the fever. During this time, Diana continued to oversee his care, spending hours reading to him, discussing estate matters, or simply sitting in companionable silence as he dozed. These quiet days of convalescence revealed aspects of George Churchill that Diana might never have discovered otherwise. His dry wit, his extensive knowledge of literature, his thoughtful opinions on everything from agricultural techniques to political reform. Without the pressures of formal society or the weight of managing the estate, he seemed lighter somehow, more inclined to conversation and even occasional laughter. For his part, the Marquis observed his wife with new eyes. The woman who had nursed him through the fever was not the proper, somewhat reserved Lady Diana he had married, but a determined, compassionate force of nature who had faced down fear to care for him when others would not. "You risked your own health," he remarked one afternoon as they sat before the fire in his sitting room, Diana reading aloud from a volume of Scott's poetry. "Why?" Diana closed the book, marking her place with a ribbon. "Would you have had me abandon you to the care of frightened servants, or a hired nurse who saw you only as a duty? Most wives of our circle would have done precisely that," he pointed out. "It would have been perfectly acceptable." "I am not most wives," Diana replied simply, "and I did not marry you to be acceptable, but to be your wife, in name at least, if nothing more." Something flickered in his eyes at her words. "And if I wished for more than a wife in name only?" Diana's heart quickened. "Then you would need to tell me what that means, my lord, for you once made it very clear that I would never be your true wife." The Marquis winced slightly at the reminder of his cold declaration. "I was not at my best when we met," he admitted. "I had convinced myself that a marriage of convenience was all I required, all I deserved, perhaps." "And now?" Diana asked softly. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. "Now I find myself wondering what might be possible between two people who began as strangers, but have perhaps become something more." Diana felt a rush of emotion too complex to name. "I would like to discover that as well," she said, her voice hardly above a whisper. For a moment they sat in silence, hands joined, the fire crackling in the grate. Then the Marquis, George, spoke again. "There are things you should know about me, Diana, things I have never shared with anyone." His face was solemn, his eyes shadowed. "About my mother's death, about Catherine." Diana squeezed his hand gently. "There will be time for all of that," she assured him. "When you are stronger." He nodded, grateful for the reprieve, yet somehow lighter for having expressed the intention. "Will you read a little more?" he asked. "Your voice, it brings me peace." Diana opened the book again, resuming where she had left off, her heart full of tentative hope. The road ahead might not be smooth. There were clearly wounds in her husband's past that had not yet healed, secrets that still haunted him. But for the first time she believed they might travel it together. As she read the poet's words of love and longing, she felt George's gaze upon her face, no longer distant or guarded, but warm with something that might, in time, grow into affection, perhaps even love. From the hallway outside, Mrs. Winters observed the scene through the partially open door, the Marquis and his bride, hands clasped, faces illuminated by firelight, a tableau of quiet intimacy that reminded the old housekeeper of another couple long ago. "Lady Eleanor would approve," she murmured to herself as she moved away, a rare smile softening her stern features. Her son has found his way home at last. November arrived with bitter winds and early frosts, but within Blackwood Manor, a different sort of change was taking place. The weeks following the Marquis's illness had brought a gradual but unmistakable shift in his relationship with Diana. They now took most meals together, spent evenings in the library sharing books and conversation, and walked the grounds arm in arm when weather permitted. Though they still maintained separate bedchambers, a fact that occasionally caused Diana moments of wistful contemplation, in most other respects they had begun to forge a true partnership. Yet despite this new closeness, Diana sensed her husband still held part of himself in reserve. The name he had spoken during his fever, Catherine, had not been mentioned again, though it lingered in Diana's thoughts. Who was this woman whose memory caused him such pain? Another piece of the puzzle that was George Churchill, waiting to be revealed. Her opportunity came on a dreary afternoon when rain lashed the windows of Blackwood Manor, confining them indoors. Diana was arranging dried flowers from the garden in a porcelain vase when George entered the drawing room, a hesitant expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he said, coming to stand beside her, "about what I said during my recovery, that there were things you should know about me." Diana's fingers stilled among the rose hips and dried lavender. "Yes? If we are truly to build something between us, you deserve to know the truth." He gestured to the sofa. "Would you sit with me? It's not a brief tale." Diana joined him, her heart quickening at his serious tone. For a long moment, George stared into the fire as if gathering his thoughts, or his courage. "I told you my mother died when I was 12, he began finally. "What I didn't explain was that after her death my father changed, or perhaps, as you once suggested, he simply revealed his true nature without her moderating influence." He drew a deep breath, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "He became cruel, particularly to me. He blamed me for her death. She fell ill after nursing me through a similar fever, and he made certain I knew it." George's voice remained steady, but Diana saw the tension in his clasped hands. "Lady Caroline encouraged his bitterness. She had always resented my mother, and now she had her opportunity to erase Eleanor Churchill's memory from Blackwood. That's why the garden was abandoned," Diana said softly. "Yes, it was the first thing to go. Then her portraits were moved to storage, her rooms redecorated, her name rarely spoken." A muscle worked in his jaw. "I was sent away to school shortly after, not Eton, where my friends were, but a remote, austere institution in Scotland, known for its harsh discipline. My father claimed it would make a man of me." Diana's heart ached at the thought of a grieving boy, sent away from everything familiar, shouldering an undeserved burden of guilt. How long were you there? 6 years. I was permitted home only briefly in summers, and by then Lady Caroline was effectively mistress of Blackwood, though my father never actually married her. His voice hardened. She had hoped he would, of course. That was always her ambition, to be Marchioness of Blackwood, but my father was too shrewd to grant her the legal status she craved. And Adelaide? Her daughter? A shadow crossed George's face. Adelaide came to Blackwood when she was 10, a quiet, frightened girl. My father treated her with a kindness he never showed me, which Lady Caroline was quick to interpret as evidence that he might adopt Adelaide as his ward, perhaps even make her his heir if I continued to disappoint him. Diana's eyes widened. Could he have done such a thing? Set aside his own son and heir? Not legally, no, but he could have made my position extremely difficult had he chosen to. George's expression softened slightly. Adelaide herself was an innocent in her mother's schemes. We developed something of an understanding over the years, both of us pawns in games played by others. What happened when you came of age? Diana asked gently. I went to university, then travelled abroad for several years. It was easier than returning to Blackwood. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I discovered I had some aptitude for business and investment. By 25 I had built my own modest fortune, independent of my inheritance. I thought perhaps I had finally escaped my father's shadow. His expression darkened again. Then I met Catherine Hallowell. Diana's breath caught. Here at last was the mysterious Catherine, the name he had called out in his fevered state. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant, beautiful, intelligent, full of life. For the first time, George's voice wavered slightly. We met at a musical in London. She played the pianoforte brilliantly and laughed at my poor attempts at humour. Within a month I had asked for her hand and her father had consented. You were engaged, Diana said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. George nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. For 6 months. The happiest of my life. My father was furious, of course. The daughter of a merchant was hardly the match he had envisioned for the future Marquis of Blackwood. He refused to attend the wedding, threatened to cut me off entirely. But you didn't care, Diana guessed. I would have married her if she hadn't had a penny to her name, he confirmed. We had plans. A house in London, travels to Italy, a life built on our own terms. Diana already knew this story would not end happily, yet her heart contracted at the pain evident in his face. What happened? Influenza, George said simply, the single word laden with grief. 3 weeks before our wedding. I was in Edinburgh on business. By the time I received word and returned to London, she was gone. He closed his eyes briefly. I never even had the chance to say goodbye. Oh, George, Diana whispered, taking his hand in hers. I'm so sorry. He turned his hand to clasp hers, drawing strength from her touch. My father called it divine judgment, punishment for my defiance in choosing a bride he hadn't approved. Lady Caroline suggested it was Catherine's common blood that made her too weak to fight the illness. Diana's indignation flared. How dare they? To use such a tragedy to wound you further. It hardly mattered by then, George interrupted, his voice hollow. I was already devastated beyond their reach. I retreated to my London house, saw no one for months. When my father died suddenly the following year, I returned to Blackwood only out of duty. He looked around the room, his expression distant. I became Marquis of Blackwood at 28, master of an estate I had grown to hate, with a title that had brought me nothing but pain. I closed off the east wing where my mother's rooms had been, dismissed half the staff who remembered her, and dedicated myself to business matters, rarely spending more than a few weeks here at a time. And Lady Caroline? Diana asked. She expected to remain at Blackwood, of course. One of my first acts as Marquis was to settle a modest income on her and Adelaide, and establish them in a house in Bath. A hint of grim satisfaction crossed his face. She has never forgiven me for thwarting her ambitions. Diana thought of the woman's barely concealed hostility during her visit, and understood it in a new light. And for 8 years, you lived thus? Alone? Dividing your time between London and an estate you could not love? Yes, George acknowledged. Until my solicitor suggested it was time I married and secured the succession. A business arrangement, he called it, a suitable wife from a good family who would provide heirs and manage the social obligations I had neglected. He looked at Diana directly now. I agreed because it seemed the sensible course. I had convinced myself I was incapable of loving again. So why not treat marriage as I did my other affairs, practically without sentiment? Diana felt a chill at his words, remembering their first meeting and his cold declaration that she would never be his true wife. "And then I arrived," she said quietly. "Yes," George's expression softened. "You arrived, with your quiet dignity and your unexpected spirit. You who faced Lady Caroline without flinching. You who brought my mother's garden back to life." His voice dropped lower. "You who stayed when everyone else fled from my sickness." Diana's heart quickened at the warmth in his gaze. "I couldn't leave you," she said simply. "I know that now." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. "And that is why I needed to tell you about Catherine, because her memory has stood between us from the beginning. My guilt at failing her, my fear of experiencing such loss again." "You haven't failed her," Diana said firmly. "Illness claimed her, just as it nearly claimed you. Neither was your fault." "Perhaps," George conceded. "But for years I've held myself responsible, for not being there when she needed me, for not protecting her as I had promised." "And now?" Diana asked, her voice hardly more than a whisper. "Now I find myself facing a different sort of guilt." He reached up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "The guilt of realizing I have begun to care deeply for a woman who is, in fact, my wife, when I had vowed never to open my heart again." Diana leaned slightly into his touch, her pulse racing. "That is not something worthy of guilt, George." "Isn't it?" His eyes searched hers. "I told you that you would never be my true wife. I entered our marriage determined to keep you at arm's length. I denied us both the chance for happiness out of fear and old wounds." "The past cannot be undone," Diana said gently, "but the future is ours to shape, together if you wish it." For answer, George drew her closer, one hand cradling her face. "I do wish it," he murmured, "more than I believed possible." When his lips met hers, Diana felt as though some final barrier between them had dissolved. This was not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding ceremony, but a true meeting of hearts, tender, reverent, and filled with promise. As they drew apart, George kept her hand in his. "There is something else I've been meaning to show you," he said, his expression lighter than she had ever seen it. "Will you come with me?" Curious, Diana allowed him to lead her from the drawing room, up the grand staircase and down a corridor in the east wing she had never explored. They stopped before a set of double doors, which George unlocked with a key from his waistcoat pocket. "These were my mother's private rooms," he explained as he pushed open the doors. "I closed them after inheriting the title. No one has entered in 8 years." Diana stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. George moved to draw back the heavy curtains, allowing weak afternoon light to filter into a spacious sitting room. Dust cloths covered the furniture, and the air held the stillness of long disuse. Yet there was something welcoming about the space nonetheless. "It's beautiful," Diana said, taking in the elegant proportions of the room, the delicate mouldings on the ceiling, the tall windows overlooking what had been Eleanor's rose garden. "These should have been your rooms from the beginning," George said, watching her face. "As Marchioness, they are rightfully yours. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone occupying them after her, but now—" He hesitated. "Now I think my mother would want you to make them your own." Diana turned to him, deeply moved by the gesture. "Are you certain?" "Completely." He took both her hands in his. "Diana, I have spent too many years allowing grief to dictate my life. It's time to honor the past without being imprisoned by it." His eyes held hers steadily. "Just as my mother's garden is blooming again under your care, perhaps Blackwood itself can become a true home once more." "I would like that," Diana said softly. "Very much." "There's something else," George added, his manner suddenly less certain. "Something I've been considering since my recovery." "Yes?" Diana prompted when he hesitated. "Our current arrangement, separate rooms, separate lives in many ways. It was what I wanted when we married." He drew a deep breath. "It is not what I want now." Diana's heart began to race. "What are you saying, George?" "I'm asking if you would consider, if you might wish to—" He shook his head, seemingly frustrated with his own awkwardness. Diana, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife in truth, not merely in name? The question hung in the air between them, momentous and yet so simple. Diana looked at the man before her, no longer the cold, distant Marquis who had once declared she would never be his true wife, but a man who had shown her his wounded heart and was now offering it into her keeping. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "I would be honored to be your true wife, George." The smile that transformed his face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He drew her into his arms, holding her as though she were infinitely precious. "I cannot promise you a perfect happiness," he said against her hair. "I have been too long in darkness to find the light easily." "I don't ask for perfection," Diana replied, echoing words she had spoken to him during his illness. "Only for honesty, and the chance to build something real between us." Their lips met again, the kiss deeper now, filled with newfound hope and possibilities neither had dared imagine when they had first met in his study all those months ago. Outside, the rain had stopped, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast a golden glow over Eleanor Churchill's newly restored garden. Inside, two people who had come together through duty were discovering something far more precious, a love born of compassion, strengthened through adversity, and now ready to flourish in the light of truth. In the months that followed, Blackwood Manor underwent a transformation as remarkable as that of its master and mistress. Diana moved into Eleanor's rooms, which were redecorated with her own taste, while preserving elements of their original character. The east wing, long closed off, became once again a center of life and activity. George found himself rediscovering his childhood home through Diana's eyes, seeing beauty where he had only remembered pain, finding comfort in traditions he had long abandoned. Together they began visiting the tenant farms, inspecting cottages that needed repair, establishing a school for the estate children. Diana's practical nature complemented his business acumen, creating improvements that benefited everyone who called Blackwood home. As winter settled over the countryside, blanketing the restored rose garden in snow, they established new traditions of their own, evenings by the fire in the library, reading to each other from favorite books, Sunday visits to the village church, where George had not set foot since inheriting the title. Christmas decorations more lavish than Blackwood had seen in a decade, culminating in a feast for the tenants in the great hall. And at night, in the privacy of what was now their shared bedchamber, they discovered each other anew, not as the strangers who had wed out of duty and convenience, but as partners who had chosen each other freely, with full knowledge of the other's strengths and frailties. It was in such a moment, as they lay entwined in the darkness, that Diana finally found courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since learning of Catherine. "Do you still think of her?" she asked softly, her head resting on George's chest. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Sometimes," he admitted, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "Not with the sharp grief of before, but with a kind of gratitude. She taught me I was capable of love when I had begun to doubt it. I wish I could have known her," Diana said sincerely. "She would have liked you." George pressed a kiss to her forehead. "But it is you, Diana Churchill, who has brought me back to life. You who has made Blackwood a home again." Diana smiled in the darkness. "We have done it together." "Yes," he agreed, drawing her closer. "And we have a lifetime ahead to continue the work." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of winter wind. Diana was nearly asleep when George spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I had convinced myself that love was a weakness, that it made one vulnerable to unbearable loss." His arms tightened around her. "I was wrong. Love is the greatest strength we possess. It takes more courage to open one's heart than to keep it locked away." Diana raised herself on one elbow to look down at her husband's face, silver in the moonlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. "When did you become so wise, my lord?" she asked, only half teasing. George smiled, reaching up to touch her cheek. "When I had the good sense to marry a woman wiser than myself," he replied, though I was too stubborn to recognize it at first. Diana laughed softly, settling back into his embrace. "We have both learned much since that first meeting in your study." "Indeed," George agreed, "though there is one thing I knew even then, despite my best efforts to deny it." "And what was that?" "That you were extraordinary, Diana Russell." He kissed her with tender reverence. and that I was fortunate beyond measure that you had agreed to become Diana Churchill. Outside, snow continued to fall, mantling Blackwood Manor in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, the Marquis and Marchioness of Blackwood drifted to sleep, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had become something far more rare and precious. A true meeting of hearts, bound by a love that had overcome pride, pain, and the shadows of the past to find its way into the light. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the gardens of Blackwood Manor as Diana watched from the terrace. 4-year-old Eleanor Catherine Churchill, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit, led her younger brother James on a merry chase among the rose bushes. "Careful, Ellie," Diana called. "Your brother cannot run as quickly as you." The little girl slowed obligingly, turning to take her toddling brother's hand with surprising gentleness. "Come on, Jamie," she said. "I'll show you the frog pond." Diana smiled, one hand resting unconsciously on her rounded belly where their third child grew. The doctors were confident this pregnancy would be as healthy as her previous two, but George still insisted she rest frequently. As if summoned by her thoughts, her husband appeared at her side, placing a protective arm around her waist. "Our daughter has her mother's kind heart," he observed, watching the children. "And her father's leadership abilities," Diana added with a smile. "No one refuses Ellie anything when she sets her mind to it." George chuckled, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar over the years. "Heaven help us when she comes of age. The ton won't know what hit them." They stood in comfortable silence, watching their children explore the world they had created together. A world built on trust, respect, and deep, abiding love. "Do you ever think about that day when we first met?" Diana asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How different things might have been if we had continued as we began." George pressed a kiss to her temple. "I try not to dwell on what might have been, but I thank Providence every day that you were brave enough to see beyond my walls, stubborn enough to remain when I pushed you away, and loving enough to show me what it meant to truly live again." Diana turned in his arms to face him. "It wasn't bravery," she said softly. "It was love, perhaps even before I recognized it myself." "Then I am the most fortunate of men," he said, "to have been loved so well." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns of Blackwood Manor, Diana reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a cold business arrangement to a marriage of true hearts. The path had not always been smooth, but each challenge had only strengthened the bond between them. The man who had once declared she would never be his true wife now looked at her as though she were his entire world. And in his eyes, Diana saw the reflection of her own heart, complete, cherished, and utterly at home. "Come," George said, offering his arm. "Let's join our children. James has been asking all morning to show you his collection of interesting stones." Diana took his arm, smiling up at the man she had come to know and love so deeply. "Lead the way, my love. Lead the way." And together they walked into the sunshine, toward the future they had built with patience, courage, and the transformative power of love. The end. Dear listener, tonight's story reminded us that even in a marriage built on cold agreements and silent halls, love can bloom quietly, one gesture, one moment of care at a time. Maybe you too have felt that some doors in life were closed for good, that it was too late to begin again, to trust, to soften. But this tale gently whispers what life itself tries to show us. The heart does not age in its capacity to feel, to heal, to love. You who have walked through so many seasons, who have known loss, sacrifice, and perhaps long silences, you carry within you the quiet strength of Diana, who chose kindness when she was met with coldness. And maybe, like the Marquis, you carry wounds you've never spoken aloud. That's okay. What matters is that healing is still possible. Connection is still possible. Love in all its forms is still possible. Let that truth rest on your heart tonight like a warm blanket. May you sleep knowing that you are not forgotten, not alone, not too late for beauty or tenderness. There is still light ahead. There is still warmth waiting for you. May peace surround your dreams, and may tomorrow greet you with quiet hope, with heartfelt gratitude, from all of us at Legends of the Fall. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We hope this story embraced your heart the way it did ours. If it brought you peace, emotion, or even a quiet tear, consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, sharing it with someone dear, and leaving us a heartfelt comment. From the depths of our hearts, thank you for supporting Legends of the Fall. Your presence gives us strength to keep telling these stories, full of love, second chances, and redemption. At the end of this video, you'll see another beautiful story suggestion from our channel. Click and let yourself be moved again.